Kia ora folks, Q Modeler here, and in today's video I'm going to be building this, the 1989 release of the Airfix Havilland Mosquito. I've also got some X-Tray decals for this kit as well, so I feel like doing some aftermarket markings. Here are the decals. They seem fairly good quality. I've not actually used X-Tray decals before, so see how they turn out. And here's the paint job I'm going to be doing as nice bright yellow scheme. And that is a de Havilland Mosquito T.3, T for trainer, number 608 Squadron, based at RAF Manton, August 1948. So without any further to say, let's get started. Right, so here are the components for the cockpit. I've decided to modify this Mosquito as the tooling dates back from 1972. So as you can imagine, there's not really a lot of detail. So I've already started doing some slight modifications. Here on one side, as you can see, I've got like a door and a couple of pieces of radio and some wire. I've done the same on the other side with some control systems and everything. And then I've got these two backboard pieces here, which will be going just after the seats. That's because if I don't put that in there, there's going to be like this massive hole in the back. I've also got two control columns, as this is a dual controlled aircraft since it's a trainer. I don't know if that's strictly accurate, but as there's no photos of the Mosquito T3, but yeah, I'll just have to see. Right, moving along, I'm already starting to modify the cockpit here, so I need to fill these holes in. As I said earlier, there's no photos that I could find of the interior of the de Havilland Mosquito T3. So since it's a dual controlled aircraft, I'm assuming the pilot seat and the trainee's seat will be next to each other. So I'm filling in these holes where the co-pilot seat would have been, and I'm going to move the trainee's seat forward a bit, so then the pilot and trainee seat will be next to each other. I don't know if that's strictly accurate, but yeah, I'll go with it. Next, as you can see, I'm putting the control columns in place. As you can see, I had to widen the hole for one of them as the fit wasn't quite right. But the second one, I got it off an old Airfix Mosquito that I had lying around that I could take parts off. And for that, I just had to cut off the attachment point and then sand it smooth so there wouldn't be any bump that could get in the way whenever gluing it onto the base of the cockpit. Here I'm gluing in that backboard that I mentioned earlier. This was incredibly fiddly as I had to get them aligned properly and also make sure they wouldn't get in the way of the cockpit floor. Eventually I managed to get it right. Once the backboard had been put in place, I glued in this radio, which on the original instructions was meant to go on the side, but since I've got a backboard in place, I can stick it on the backboard where it's meant to go. With the cockpit complete, I can now paint it with Tamiya XF71 cockpit green. I also took the opportunity to do the wheel wells as well. Looking at some of my references, apparently the top of the gear bays were left in their bare metal finish. So to complete this, I used Tamiya X32 titanium. Using Tamiya's XF69, I painted the rubber parts of the control columns and the leather parts on the seat, making sure I only went halfway up the seats as apparently the padding doesn't go all the way to the top for some reason. And here's where the quality of the video gets a lot better, as unfortunately throughout pretty much the entire assembly and painting of the cockpit I had the wrong lens on the GoPro, but now I've got the right lens on, so hopefully the rest of the video will be a lot better quality. I'm also painting the side panels on the interior of the cockpit. Right, now I'm attaching the control panel on, which I had already painted off camera, and as you can see I've attached the seat belts, which were unfortunately too fiddly to do on camera like my previous videos. The second to last step before I could close up the cockpit was to do a little bit of minor weathering. This was simply giving the whole cockpit a dark wash just to highlight the few details that were in there. And finally I can glue the completed cockpit into one half of the fuselage. Next I glued the other half of the fuselage on before I moved on with the rest of the model. Next I can attach the canopy onto the model, which as you can see I've already pre-masked, which took me probably about 3 hours to do, hence why I didn't show the masking. And I've already painted it as well with the with XF71, as of course the interior of the cockpit would not be painted the same color as the exterior. Here I'm attaching the landing lights into place. These were fairly fiddly, but eventually I managed to get them in. I also went over the backs of the landing lights with some Tamiya X32 titanium to give that sort of shine that lights have, a reflective shine. Next I could glue the upper half and lower half of the wings together. Moving along, I can begin to assemble the engine nacelles. Now in the instructions it says to assemble the landing gear and then glue the landing gear into one half of the engine nacelle before attaching the other half on. I decided not to do that because it would make masking and painting very challenging, but unfortunately I would come to regret it later on, and yeah, it was a real pain. Here I can attach the exhaust onto the engine nacelles, making sure I get the right version of exhaust, as in the Airfix kit you get the shrouded and unshrouded exhaust, so apparently the aircraft that I'm representing uses shrouded exhaust, so that's what I'm using here. The final thing to attach onto the engine nacelles is this small piece here. Not quite sure what it is, but as you can see the fit on here was really not that good, so I went in later with some Vallejo filler and basically just covered the entire thing in filler just to make it flush. Next it was time to assemble the horizontal stabilizers and attach them onto the tail. Here I'm gluing on the engines. Now these were surprisingly difficult to glue on. There were massive gaps just on the connection points between the wing and the engine that I had to fill in, and of course with all the rivets I had to be very careful not to get any filler over the rivets. But yeah, it was a real pain doing this, but eventually I managed to get them on. They look alright. Next I can attach the wings. Now the fit here, unlike the engines, was actually surprisingly good. It's a nice solid fit for such a small attachment point. Moving along, I can begin to put the propellers together. Now there's two types of propellers that come in the Airfix kit. There's some with pointed tips and some with rounded tips. Now, of the few photos that I could find of the T3 version of the Mosquito, it looks like that it probably would have had rounded tips, so I went with that, and then I just glued the nose cone on top. Next I used Tamiya's XF2 white as a primer layer, painting that over the whole model. It also acted as a nice base coat before the yellow, as the white makes the yellow stand out a lot more. It's now time to do some pre-shading using Tamiya's XF69 NATO Black. Now I haven't really done much pre-shading on my models, and this is actually the first time I've done pre-shading using an airbrush, so the work was a little bit messy in some places, but the fact that the Mosquito doesn't have many panel lines helped a bit. And at last I can move on to the main paint job using Vallejo's US Interior Yellow. I sprayed this over the entire model in very thin coats, slowly building up so that the pre-shading would still show through. Right, so before I begin putting decals down, take a quick look at the decals themselves. So at the top here it says the Havilland Mosquito, and then has different variants of the Mosquito. And then on the front we have some information about how to apply decals, and also a website to Hamilton's models. On the back it has other different mosquitoes and other markings that you can do things in and stuff like that. And then we have the decals themselves. So as I said earlier, they seem fairly good quality. Not too thick, not too thin. I'll just have to see whenever I get around to putting them on, but yeah, you get quite a bit of decal, quite a few decals as you can see. And then we have all the different paint jobs here. So on this side we have an Australian paint job, nice grey and green, and then a few different other paint jobs for the tops and bottoms of the aircraft. Then we have a few RAF schemes and bare metal finish, and then the yellow paint job that I'll be doing. There's also some, just get them over here, here we go, Canadian paint jobs. Those aren't the most interesting, just in the classic grey, dark grey, light grey and green. Then we have a US scheme, which is fairly interesting, might do that in the future. I have a couple other schemes, including an East Asia Command one. And what else? And here's another one. At the paint jobs for the top and undersides of some of the aircraft. Flipping on over, we have the paint jobs for the top and the undersides of some of the other aircraft, including the scheme I'm doing. So those are the decals. Now, they look fairly good quality, but we'll just have to see as I begin to lay them down on the model. So the way I applied the decals was by first laying down some micro set onto the surface where I put the decal, then applying the decal on, and then later going over it with some micro sol. And now for that dreaded landing gear that I mentioned earlier. So as you can see, I've already painted the wheels with XF85 NATO black, and then the centers with the XF32 titanium. And then I glued the two halves of the wheels together, and before gluing them onto the actual landing gear frame, and it was just so fiddly. I don't know how long it took me to do. And actually, whenever I'd finished putting the landing gear on, I dropped the Mosquito and broke the landing gear and just had to do that all over again. It was so painful. So anyone who has this kit, just be warned. And now on a lighter note, we can begin doing some minor weathering. So to start off with the weathering process, I did some minor chipping. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Mosquito is actually quite famous due to it being made almost completely out of wood. So there's not many metal parts to chip here, just the engines really and the props. But I got a sponge and did a little bit of sponge chipping around some of the areas that may get some paint worn away to expose the bare metal finish underneath, and just did that all over the areas that were metal. Finally, to finish off the weathering, I covered the whole model with some ammo dark panel liner, and then to remove it, I got damp paper towel and pulled it back over the surfaces in the direction of the airflow. I also covered the wheels with some light grey pigments just to give a bit of dirt maybe that's built up on the wheels or something. And now for the incredibly satisfying moment you've probably all been waiting for, removing the masking tape from the canopy. Now this came away fairly easily and actually did quite a good job. There was a couple of areas where paint got through, but managed to clean those away pretty quickly, and as you can see, it's quite nice and clear. After I gave the whole model a matte coat, I glued the propellers on, and with that I called this build of the Airfix Havilland Mosquito T.3 of 1989 release complete. Now for some history on the Mosquito. First flying on November the 25th, 1940, before entering service on November the 15th, 1941, the de Havilland Mosquito is one of Britain's most famous Second World War era aircraft. It was easily modified for many different roles, including bomber, fighter, night fighter, recon, and many more. It was in service with 24 different nations before being retired in 1963, due to the fact it was almost entirely made out of wood, meant it was much faster than some of the top military aircraft around the world. It could even carry a heavier payload than the famed Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The version of Mosquito I built was a Mosquito T Mark III, which was a two-seater trainer version of the aircraft. It was unarmed and had a modified cockpit with dual control arrangements, a total of 348 T Mark IIIs were built by the RAF and Fleet Air Arms. Australia also built 11 T Mark 43 trainers, which were similar compared to the T Mark III. So now I'll give my overall summary of the kit. So the kit, as I said, suffers from lack of detail and lack of fitting properly, really. It's in the end, it does give a fairly accurate representation of the mosquito. I mean, you will be able to tell it's a mosquito. But would I recommend it? Probably not. There are a lot more modern tools of the mosquito out there. As I've said earlier, this is a 1989 release of the kit, but the tooling dates back from 1972. You can get more modern tools, like Airfix have got two new mosquitoes out. They've got a bomber version and a reconnaissance version. I'm pretty sure Tamiya's got a fighter version out as well, so you can get that if you want to do a fighter. But if you want to do like something more challenging, like and you're into vintage models like me, then yeah, go ahead, buy one. But yeah, for a beginner, if I would recommend getting a slightly newer kit. The model that I did do, as I said, is a T3, so I had to modify it slightly. But in the end, I like the result that I came out with. It's a decent enough result. So, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. But yeah, without any further say, I'm Kiwi Modeler, and I'll see you next time.